Good evening. Disclobros will tell you that the truth about life on Earth will be revealed in government documents. And I guess in a very limited sense, they're right. We humans, even all our friends who are government employees, are humans after all. Government documents are material culture. And all of this activity, any of it at all, is ultimately evidence of the activity of the great dragon. The great dragon engulfs all other dragons. The giant pterosaurs that migrated between the world's farthest shores are dragons too, but they are only microscopic dragons on the scale of the great dragon. The largest living creature by far, the longest creature by duration in the known universe, and also that which contains all of us and is mother to all of us, as well as every other creature, organism, or dragon on the planet. The deeply ancient great dragon extends for billions of years into the past, coiling and coiling about the sun along with the Earth's rotating surface, which they envelop like a shell. The head of the dragon is the present moment for all of life, and the length extends so deeply in time humans cannot comprehend. At every moment, dark and sleepy night covers half the great dragon, while daytime covers the other half. At every moment, the sunrise pushes east across half the dragon, in a long, slender arc from pole to pole, where the dragon pulses into daytime activity. And at every moment, on the exact opposite side of the planet, the great dragon wilts and hides at the last red light of the sunset, which endlessly retreats westward. What will happen to the dragon during the climate crisis? What will happen 100 years after, 1,000, 1,000,000, or 10 years after? What will happen to humans? What will happen to the place you are now? The answers to these questions will only come with the never-ending incremental disclosure of sunset. Deep lore drops in the prologue. Check. This is there is a very special type of close encounter of the third kind, the kind that happens in the south of France on a lavender farm. Also, prairie lights. Who are they really? Plus, we reveal that Ufo Sunset was just a nickname for our now defunct project, a UFO-themed a cappella group called AAWSAP. All this and more tonight. I'm Rachel Nelson.
I'm Luis Cayetano.
Jeff Knox is not quite here yet due to some technical issues, but he will be with us shortly. Here he is now. Hi, Jeff. But he will be
Hey, Jeff.
Shortly.
Hey.
Here he is now. Hi, Jeff.
Hello.
Hey, Jeff.
I did not know I was on yet, but okay, cool. Hey.
Here's Jeff from 30 Seconds in the Past.
Crap. Let me. Yeah.
There we go.
Okay, there we go. Sorry about that, guys. Yeah, I didn't know I was on yet. I still don't have my browser crashed today, and I had to reboot my computer, and I still haven't got things loaded. So
that's quite all right.
But
Thank
hello.
you. Hello. Welcome to Ufo Sunset. And now for the rebrief. A new paper defends the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. The Younger Dryas was a cold period that marked the last major period of glaciers, which lasted a little over 1,000 years. Shortly after this period ended 11,700 years ago, human agriculture first developed. Many researchers in recent decades have been promoting the idea that this period was kicked off by an impact event about 12,900 years ago. A paper published in May in the journal Airbursts and Cratering Impacts offers new evidence in support of this idea. They argue that shock-fractured quartz is evidence of a bolide airburst, or the explosion of an object from space in the Earth's atmosphere, as these shock fractures are similar to shock fractures caused by atomic blasts. The paper suggests that the Younger Dryas was kicked off by a comet that exploded into fragments in the atmosphere, similar to the Tunguska event in 1908 when a bolide exploded over Siberia, sending shockwaves around the world and clearing hundreds of miles of forest. From the article abstract, quote, sediment sequences spanning the 12,800-year-old Lower Younger Dryas boundary were investigated at 3 widely separated sites in eastern North America: Parsons Island, Maryland, a Newtonville sandpit in southern New Jersey, and Flamingo Bay, South Carolina. All sequences examined exhibit peak abundance in platinum, microspherules, and melt glass, representing the Younger Dryas boundary cosmic impact layer resulting from the airbursts/impacts of a fragmented comet, approximately 12,800 years ago. Unquote. But this paper comes amid ongoing controversy around the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. In a lengthy paper published in Earth Science Reviews in December of 2023, which is called Comprehensive Refutation of the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, the authors argue that there is no clear evidence of an impact event. Among other criticisms, they write in the abstract, quote, the physical evidence offered in support of an impact is nano to microscopic in scale, e.g. charcoal, carbon spherules, magnetic grains/spherules, nanodiamonds, and platinum minerals, to name a few. However, many have critical issues with their identification, measurement, and interpretation. Unquote. This new paper also attempts to counter criticism of the impact hypothesis from the 2023 paper. The 2023 paper argues that ice core measurements of a purported platinum anomaly that happened at the beginning of the Younger Dryas period were actually 30 years after the beginning of the Younger Dryas cooling. The new study critiques this finding and states that the new evidence of platinum anomalies at the 3 different sites in North America are all within 30 years of the Younger Dryas onset. And bat murmurations appear on radar in Arizona. An enormous flock consisting of thousands of bats was caught on radar emerging from a tunnel in Phoenix in late June, Fox 10 News reported. The bats are mostly female and roost in the tunnel in the Biltmore area of Phoenix, Arizona. The bats use this place to incubate their young, after which they will migrate south to Mexico. Gabriel Lohero at the National Weather Service explained, quote, the radar switches to a clear air mode so that the antenna will scan more slowly. And when it scans more slowly, it is able to pick up more artifacts that may be non-precipitation related, such as any airborne particulates, dust, and in this case, bats, unquote. According to Jonathan Dairbridge from the School of Natural Resources and the Environment at I'm sorry, I made an error there. I believe that is at the University of Arizona. I will correct that later. The numbers of bats will likely increase later in the summer. Also in the summer, a visible nova is forecast in the night sky, sometime in the coming months. Astronomers forecast that a giant stellar explosion called a nova will become visible in a constellation in the northern hemisphere named Corona Borealis. The nova will resemble a new star temporarily blinking into the sky for around a week. This will happen in the binary star system, T Coronae Borealis, or TCRB for short, which is located about 3,000 light years from Earth. The system consists of two stars, a red giant and a white dwarf. The small and dense white dwarf pulls matter off of the red giant, and about every 80 years it pulls off so much matter that it causes a massive explosion, a nova. TCRB has had previous novas, one in 1946 and one in 1866, and before each of these, TCRB brightened for several years before then dimming. This brightening and then dimming has been observed in recent years too, causing researchers to predict that T Coronae Borealis is due for another stellar explosion, which we should get to view sometime in the next few months. Now, we decided to rearrange the show just for this week a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead with my piece first, and then we're going to follow that up with Luis Cayetano's piece on the AAWSAP AATIP shenanigans, and then after that, for our grand finale, Jeff will have a wonderful, detailed presentation on the Valensole close encounter case. Now, if I was on a desert island and I could only choose the corpus of all known references to one legendary or para-weird entity, it would surely be uncanny lights that came out at night. There have always been various different types of nocturnal light sightings, and not just lights associated with UFOs or even airships. No, not at all, and it somehow wouldn't do if that was the case. A world without nocturnal lights would be a darker world indeed. Now, while airships and other phantom aircraft may sometimes follow a pattern of waves, like the 1896 and 97 airship wave in the US, do spook lights and other common nocturnal lights follow this type of pattern too? I think we'll find that while the answer is sort of, it's also very hard to tell. In any case, the spook light or ghost light is a very common feature in folklore. Some spook lights, like the Paulding Light in Michigan or the Joplin, Missouri spook light, are caused by simple optical phenomena associated with cars driving at night. I think we can probably expect these types of lights to be reported pretty regularly, since they have known physical causes that happen regularly. But reports of spook lights, spirit lights, or ghosts lights also commonly predate the era of cars, let alone flying saucers. Here are some reports of spooks at Crawfordshire, Indiana in 1891. These sightings were explained in one news story as a flock of killdeer. In a famous case from Norwich, England in the late 1900s, there were numerous reports of luminous owl sightings. There are diverse descriptions of other similar lights. Hufford also cites, for example, jack-o'-lantern sightings in Newfoundland around 1900, noting their similarity to some modern UFO reports. Another common one in English-speaking folklore is the will-o'-the-wisp that misleads travelers. Nocturnal lights are also reported in diverse cultures, often associated with spirits or supernatural entities. Spirit lights, or hitodama, that are in essence the ghosts of the dead, as well as demon lights, or onibi, are described in the folklore and popular media of Japan, for example. Now, tonight I just wanted to highlight a few examples of the pre-UFO era nocturnal light type report, mostly from a few newspaper articles I found in the Library of Congress free online newspaper archives. These are stories of so-called ghost lights reported in and perhaps around Meade County, Kansas, in at least February through April of 1913. What follows is a later sighting by the Compton family in their horse-drawn carriage from the April 16th Americus Daily Times Recorder. Quote, "A few nights ago, John C. Compton, traveling overland with his family from Oklahoma to Lake, Kansas, drove hastily into Meade and reported seeing a strange light in the very vicinity where the mysterious Sand Creek ghost light formerly held forth. We were driving along slowly when suddenly a great white light, very bright, appeared to be coming toward us," said Mr. Compton. "When the light came within a few rods of us, it suddenly disappeared, only to reappear in a short time." It was northwest of Lakeland. Just how far we were from the post office I cannot say, but I should judge about 6 or 7 miles. Every time the light appeared, the horses reared and plunged, and we were compelled to stop to avert a runaway. At first I thought it was an automobile light, but it was too large and bright for that, and as no machine appeared, I gave up that idea. It was certainly the most bewildering and gruesome light I ever saw, and I cannot understand what it was." Unquote. It seems that many locals, such as a W.L. Painter, were very familiar with the light. When questioned, says Painter, quote, "I have seen it on 25 or 30 different occasions, but have never been able to explain it. It would first appear like the light of a lantern, but immediately bloomed out as big as a full moon. It looked somewhat like the headlight of a locomotive coming around a curve suddenly, and was accompanied by a roaring sound like the escaping of steam, but there is no railroad within 20 miles. It reappeared at intervals of from 1 to 7 days. It would never get closer than 60 or 70 rods, and seemed always to come from the northwest. I and members of my family have observed it many times. We know it in our neighborhood as the ghost light. When it shows up, it always badly frightens horses and has been the cause of many runaway accidents. The horses seem to know its approach before it is sighted. About 6 years ago, many others besides myself repeatedly saw this ghastly light, and it disappeared about the same time that the Germans settled that portion of the country. At one time, it appeared to be directly in front of the Lakeland post office, and several times while driving at night has it appeared, always causing the horses to be alarmingly frightened. One citizen saw it and attempted to go to it, but it disappeared with no remaining sign or mark left to tell the tale." Unquote. I am struck by the mention of the roaring sound. Could this offer an explanation for what the light was, or was the reported sound caused by something unrelated to the light. There were also articles in newspapers in the months before, from the Hutchinson, Kansas News on March 17th of 1913, quote, "A prominent Meade man now adds his experience to those who have already seen the light, and this gentleman is none other than H.N. Holdeman, our popular breeder of high-class cattle and hogs, living 1.5 miles south of this city." On the evening of March 3rd, Mr. Holdeman was going home from Meade, and when he entered the north and south road, he noticed ahead of him, quite a distance, a light close to the ground. As he drew nearer, he noticed the strange light was in the road near the lane running to his residence. At first he thought it was a snowbank near the corner of the fence. So white was the light. But as he approached, no snow was visible, and the mysterious illumination lit up the road and fields for several rods around. As soon as he reached the place where the ghost light appeared, he at once got out of his vehicle to make investigation. As he approached, within a few yards of the light, it rose from the ground and came directly toward him, and then apparently only a few feet away, disappeared and was all dark. Mr. Holdeman says it was a very strange experience, and he would like very much for some scientists to inform him what this strange and uncanny light could be. Unquote. This clipping comes from a collection of clippings on ghost lights that are available for free on kufos.org. It's clear from this article that numerous other sightings were reported in February. I found other articles from March and April too. From the Topeka State Journal, quote, "Lakeland, Kansas, March 18th. Farmers and stockmen here are making up a purse to bring a scientist here to investigate a ghost light, which is seen almost nightly and is causing alarm. R.H. Painter, Orrin Van Dusen, and H.N. Holdeman have observed the mysterious light. It first appears as a motor car light, but when approached, it rises from the ground and disappears. It has been seen most frequently in Sand Creek Township." Unquote. Personally, these reports sound quite a lot like modern spooklight reports and are likely some form of simple optical phenomenon involving the light from distant car or train headlamps. It's odd to me that this article mentions an R.H. Painter, and the witness from the much later article is named W.L. Painter, but this could easily just be a coincidence, if not a highly improbable and without a doubt certainly not the case scenario of twins working telepathically with plasma entities. Now, in his account, W.L. Painter says that they've made many, quote, "attempts to ascertain the cause of the strange light," unquote. I wonder if someone ever endeavored to explain the light by studying it in the field. It seems doubtful, but maybe? From the Topeka Daily State Journal, April 26, 1913, quote, "The mystery of the Meade County ghost light has not yet been solved to my knowledge, although scientists, investigators, spiritualists, and even more or less scientific gentlemen have been busy on the case." "There isn't any joke about this ghost light either," remarked J.K. Thomas of Meade. "Many of our best people have seen it and wonder at it. The light is commonly seen in Lakeland Township. It is very similar to a marsh light, but it is much brighter. There is no low ground there and no dampness, and so it must be caused by something else than a marsh." Unquote. Here is another article that talks about a similar light observed on the dried out Walnut Creek bed near Hutchinson, Kansas, this time 3 years later in 1916. As with the Sand Creek light, the light was reportedly observed decades earlier by a local witness, one named Perry Bowman. I think there is a lot more that can likely be said about this story. There did appear to be a sort of minor scare or wave in February and March, and perhaps again in April. The statements of witnesses suggest that the light at Sand Creek may have occurred at different times in the past. But if reports are correct, then there were also previous sightings. So the wave may have been more one of newspaper notoriety at the time than one that actually reflected the frequency at which people saw these particular lights. Without knowing what caused the prairie lights at Sand Creek, Lakeland, and other places in Kansas, we can't really know for sure what caused them to be reported. A wave of reports is only an indication of how often people reported something to have happened, and not what happened or even how frequently it actually happened. Given the scant evidence I found so far, which only amounts to news articles, I have a feeling that none of these particular stories are the result of hoaxes, but who knows? Maybe I'm wrong. Hopefully, I will find more details on the Kansas ghost lights and talk about them in another episode sometime. As for tonight, I must say it was very light of you to join me on this strange journey. And now for Mr. Luis Cayetano.
Yep. So there's my recent paper with Vicente Juan Ballester Olmos. Could we get the image there to be larger, please? I just want people to be able to read it. So that is the introduction there. So this is a 74-page document, which took us a long time to write, actually. We tried to make it like up to the minute, but at some point you just have to submit it because like you'll just spend forever updating it. So obviously this one was released recently. You can find it on academia.edu. I'm sure we'll provide the link for it. And here is the introduction, and this is just a one-page intro. It talks about basically what the paper is going to go into, namely the differences between and the confusion surrounding AAWSAP and AATIP. So this is the DIA situated program, which is actually a UFO/paranormal program, but it was billed to the government and the military as a future threats weapons program. So it's like projecting into the future about what the likely systems which would threaten American platforms and systems in the future would be, and how America should adapt to that. And also here it just goes a little bit into kind of what the rest of the paper is about. So looking at the historical backdrop of UFOs back into the 20th century, and how even going further back than that, this latest craze about UAP and UFOs is actually retreading a lot of old ground, but the motifs are a little bit different. So each time they change, but the basic dynamics are the same. Now the paper itself is basically, it was conceived as a review of skinwalkers at the Pentagon by Lakatsky, Kelleher, and Knapp. So this is a 2021 book looking at there's the books right there. So the one on the left is the original one, although there had been previous books with input by these authors to do with Skinwalker and some paranormal stuff as well. But this is the one that sort of brought together the link between Skinwalker Ranch and the AAWSAP program. And it did clear up a few confusions regarding the difference between it and AATIP, but there are still a lot of questions remaining. A lot of the output, I should say, of AAWSAP has not been released. The DIRDS, Defense Intelligence Research documents, I think, or review documents. 37 unclassified documents have been released, and there's a 38th one, which is a classified version of another, of a unclassified one. But these were contracted documents, and AAWSAP did a lot of other work as well, but most of those documents have not been released to the public. The other book that we kind of touch upon, this is like the follow-up book by the same authors, Inside the US Government Covert UFO Program, Initial Revelations, goes into more detail about AAWSAP / AATIP, and goes into more detail specifically about the different projects within that overarching program. And it, tries to defend the DIRDS as well as being like proper scientific research efforts. Although we've got some misgivings about that we go into in the paper. But yeah, let's maybe go to the next image here, please. So the document after the intro starts off with a chronology. So this chronology is pretty long, and it comes up into 2024. Now, the reason it starts in 1989 is because that's when George Knapp, investigative journalist with Class TV in Las Vegas, he reached out to Senator Harry Reid on a story linking Area 51 to UFOs. And, Knapp would become famous for his breaking of the Bob Lazar story, and he's become very intimately tied to that ever since. But the chronology basically goes on from that date. It talks about the National Institute for Discovery Science, or NIDS, which is a civilian research organization set up by Robert Bigelow, who's featured very prominently in this entire saga. And he's had ties to Senator Harry Reid and others. He is the one who won the contract for AAWSAP. He set up an organization called BASS, which was underneath the umbrella of his company, Bigelow Aerospace. And he's the one who provided kind of some of the resources, although the money was actually put up by the government because it was a contracted program. And so they responded to the tender. They won the contract, even though the contract had only been advertised for, I think, 2 months before the due date, which is absurdly short. But anyway, Bigelow won that contract, and then his organization was able to undertake the AAWSAP contract, specifications. And mentioned there as well, Hal Puthoff, Jacques Vallée. These are other personalities who have featured fairly prominently in this entire saga as well. Vallée will be probably known to many of you, famous French ufologist who's been at this for, I think, 50 plus years now. Hal Puthoff has also been very prominent in the UFO scene. He's done a lot of sort of physics research and stuff into consciousness and psychic studies. So a lot of these people sort of know each other. They were involved in some of the 1970s psychic research programs linked to the CIA and the US Army. And they've also tried to find links between consciousness and UFOs. Actually, previously talked a little bit about those links in a prior show. Let's go to the next one, please. So after the chronology, which does come up to the present date, basically, and we do talk about some of those items in the chronology in more detail throughout the rest of the paper. But here it talks about the AAWSAP, which stands for Advanced Aerospace Weapons Systems Applications Program. It was nicknamed AATIP, so Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. These two names have caused a lot of confusion. So there's been debate about whether they were the same program, were they different programs, was one within the other one, when did one start and the other start, when did one begin and the other, sorry, when did one end and the other one end, etc. And also to add more confusion, Lou Elizondo is obviously a very famous UFO person now. He's been very intimately tied to the name AATIP, and many people have taken that to mean the official UFO program at the DIA. In fact, his initiative was actually a follow-on from the official AAWSAP, whose nickname was AATIP, but he retained the name AATIP. So we call it AATIP 2 later in the paper. And we go into more detail about Elizondo's role and the different ways that it is kind of obfuscated or added confusion to this entire saga. He's actually got a book coming out pretty soon. I look forward to seeing what more contradictions he piles on top of the ones he's already contributed. But here it talks about the AAWSAP's nature. So what was it really about? How was it sold to the DIA and the government, who after all did foot the bill? So $22 million. Not entirely clear how much of that money was actually spent, but that's another, murky area. So we try our best to sort of clear up those confusions and provide what's actually known in a logical format and chronology, so to let researchers kind of piece together what's actually happened. We will be doing updates on this document in the future as well, as more details come in. So AATIP / AAWSAP, the moniker itself, the AATIP moniker, arose from an unclassified nickname inserted into a letter from Senator Harry Reid to the Deputy Secretary of Defense, requesting the creation of a special access program. This was ultimately rejected. So he was seeking SAP status, which would have added another layer of secrecy, which is ironic because he's also mentioned in public that the government shouldn't hide things from its citizens. And yet here he was apparently trying to increase the secrecy of this UFO program. And Pentagon spokespeople have also contributed to the confusion about AATIP versus AAWSAP. Sometimes they've said that they're the same program, at other times that they're different, or that Elizondo was involved in one way versus another. So they've also contributed to this confusion, although we regard the primary responsibility for the confusion to have been with the team principals and with Elizondo. Okay, let's go to the next one. So the objective, he would talk about the objective of AAWSAP and how it was sold. So what did the government think it was really about? And it talks about, they're in the original solicitation placed by Lakatsky. So it talks about like breakthrough technology applications into the future, those sorts of potential threats to American systems. It doesn't explicitly talk about UFOs or extraterrestrials or any paranormal aspects, which actually kind of makes it more difficult to square with the fact that it was actually about skinwalker phenomena and the links, between consciousness and UFOs. And so like, that's kind of hard to say, what does that have to do with this solicitation? So, we think that probably, almost certainly, the government was tricked. DIA per se, or its leadership, didn't know what the program was really about when they got into it. Later on, they caught wind of that, and they probably tried to extricate themselves from the program and, pool the funding, etc., try to put it somewhere else, make it somebody else's problem. Possibly there was also an element of embarrassment there. They felt that maybe they dropped the ball. They should have known what it was about, but they didn't find out quickly enough. And so maybe some of the obfuscation that's resulted in this entire saga has actually been because of DIA leadership trying to do damage control. So we can't prove that, but it's certainly a plausible hypothesis. All right, let's go. Yes, secrecy. So here it talks about Reid's, his advocacy for transparency, and yet he was, trying to put AAWSAP under a SAP umbrella, Special Access Program. So that's kind of ironic. But still, AAWSAP was, even though it wasn't classified at the level that Reid wanted, it was still hidden, and it was a covert 2-year program. Okay, so we say here that the notable piece of Reid's political legacy for our current purposes in thinking about UAP and UFO involvement by the US government is a piece of obscurantism. All right. The location, so where was it billeted, and the timing of it, so when did it actually go from and to. That's also an area of a little bit of, it's a bit murky because we don't exactly know definitely when it started, but the DIA awarded a 2-year contract from September 21st, 2008 to September 30th, 2010, extended by DIA at no cost through December 21st, 2010. And so it probably, I mean, it ended definitely in 2012, but you know, how much of the money, the original money, was still being spent in the couple last years or so. And when did it really begin? So it's possible that Bigelow had already started to assemble people in 2007 for this program. And so some people cite the beginning of AAWSAP as being 2007, late 2007, instead of 2008. This would also speak to if that's true, then this would also speak to a kind of insider trading aspect to this program, given the issues with the tender. So there are some, you know, timing issues as well. So there's a lot of stuff in this about this program which is still kind of confusing. It's not known for sure yet, and different sources say different things. Let's go to the next one. So this is Arrow historical report summarizing the issue, the timing issue as follows for AAWSAP. AAWSAP AATIP was terminated in 2012 upon the completion of its deliverables due to DIA and DoD concerns about the project. Excuse me. So those concerns are namely to do with what had they actually gotten into, because they almost certainly didn't know what it was really about, what the team principals and participants were really doing. Again, as far as they were concerned, the DIA was concerned, it was about a future projection of weapons threats, when in fact it was really about paranormal / skinwalker / UFO phenomena. But this is from the Arrow Historical Review, that little quote there, volume 1 of the Historical Review. And yeah, so it was terminated in 2012. And the deliverables that we definitely know about, or that we can actually access, are the DIRDs, so 37 of those. But there are a bunch of other deliverables that may or may not have actually been delivered to DIA, and they still haven't been issued to the public for inspection. So those include various monthly reports, a really large 10-month report, which is almost 500 pages long, which was read apparently by Tim McMillan of Popular Mechanics. He was able to actually take some photos and give some details, but he didn't actually obtain a copy, so he couldn't show its entire contents. This is actually a sort of interesting recurring theme in ufology, where researchers or historians are allowed to sort of take a look at a document, but they can't keep it, and they can just take a few notes. So that's a kind of interesting trope there that has recurred here as well. This is a breakdown of DIA's, the AAWSAP program, actual versus projected. So fiscal year, contract term, base option year, appropriation, and some of this was not funded or executed, and the DIRDs that were produced. So here you got 37, and then the other 11 DIRDs. One of the 38 DIRDs was classified, but we've got 37 unclassified DIRDs. Okay. Management. So it was managed by Lakatsky as director, and Kelleher as well. Lakatsky served under the auspices of DIA, and Kelleher did so for BASS, and he served as a deputy administrator at BASS. So another known person was John Stratton, who would also come to feature prominently in the U.S. government UFO / UAP saga later on. Many confusions and contradictions abound. So Elizondo has obviously tried to claim his place in the organization. The 2017 New York Times article claimed that AATIP was run by him, but AATIP was just a nickname for AAWSAP, although Elizondo did apparently run some sort of more private, restricted effort later on, which assumed the name of AATIP. We call that AATIP2 later on. I'll get to that. But he may have been our chief of counterintelligence and security for the program, so he may have had some role, but it's still not for sure what he really did. And he also wrote a DOD, a complaint letter to the DOD Inspector General. Okay, so he was saying that he was the head or the director for AATIP and AAWSAP. So there you can see at the bottom there, and AAWSAP. So that's not what he says in one of his tweets, at Twitter, X, right? One of the posts on that forum. He said that he has nothing to do or had nothing to do with AAWSAP. So he's contradicted himself a number of times regarding his role with AAWSAP. And this has been really investigated a lot by Stephen Greenstreet of the New York Post, and you can check out his articles and videos to do with Elizondo. Let's go to the next one, please. Funding, so there it talks about the funding. So it's $22 million all up, but there's still a little bit of a question about how much of it was, of that $22 million was actually dispersed, how it was used, you know, what programs got what. Because it can't be that the DIRDs got most of the stuff, most of the money. I mean, they did a lot of other stuff beyond the DIRDs, but that has not been released to the public. Yeah, and maybe also just another thing about funding. It's also possible that Bigelow provided some of his own money towards the end as a kind of shoestring budget. But anyway, there's still some things which are not known. And those documents which I mentioned, which have not been released, they are still at some facility at BAS, probably at BAS, not at DIA. But if a DIA does know about stuff, then it behooves them to release it to the public as a, you know, public goodwill measure. Deliverables, so we have the DIRDs. One of them is classified. One of those 38 DIRDs is classified, but it's a classified version of a released DIRD. So these DIRDs were written by various contracted scientists. Some of them may not have known the true purpose of AAWSAP. So there are some UFO adjacent people who wrote some of the DIRDs, but other ones may not have kind of caught on. And apparently DIA didn't catch on either, even though it should have, I think. There were enough clues in things that Bigelow was saying to the media that DIA should have caught on to that. But it could also be that DIA doesn't have enough UFO savvy people who kind of know the terminology or the mythos and the history of the topic to kind of have caught on to what it was really about. So, but in any case, they may have been embarrassed by their oversight. There are some ethical questions as well about the deliverables. So, you know, DIA may not have received everything it was meant to receive, and yet it was, you know, this was a funded program using taxpayer money. So we ask questions there about the ethics. There we say massive holdings of the original analysts' journals, data, and photos remained in storage. In other words, these paid for assets were apparently never submitted to DIA. Is this ethical? In the follow-up book that they write, the authors write about the massive body of scientific papers and documents the program produced, which have mostly not been made public. The bulk of what the study produced has not been unveiled even now. Not even Congress has been able to access the vast data warehouse of the more than 100 papers produced by BAS. So, you know, taxpayers should really demand to know what happened to this output. All right. Now we get on to AATIP2, which was Elizondo's effort, and we call it AATIP2. He didn't call it that. He tried to sort of fold them into each other so that when you talk about one, you're talking about the other, and to kind of maintain his proximity in the public eye to that program. But in fact, this was not AAWSAP. This is a more restricted and private effort by him, possibly networking with some people who had been involved in AAWSAP. But this was apparently looking more specifically into military sightings by personnel and pilots. And it was not funded officially. So it didn't have any budget items, anything like that, because it was just Elizondo's kind of private initiative. He had another job that he was doing, to get paid, but this wasn't the same thing as that. So this was just kind of his own private project. We don't know really what the deliverables were. Okay. The nature, so it was officially non-existent. After the unofficially extended AAWSAP definitively ended in 2012, Elizondo followed an unofficial UAP effort of his own at the OSD, appropriating the title AATIP, which was the AAWSAP's nickname. Okay, so there's again a lot of murkiness about who knew what, and his relations to various officials and people in AAWSAP, and also, yeah. So it just gets really confusing. I think probably by design, because he said things which just blatantly contradict each other. So I don't think it's a mistake on his part that a lot of this stuff is very confused. Let's go to the next one. So objective, so Pentagon program. It's also being called a project, but it wasn't an official Pentagon program. It might have been situated at the Pentagon, but he was doing it in his own spare time, and it had much less scope than AAWSAP. So it was more about keeping tabs on military-sourced UFO sightings, not all the other skinwalker and paranormal stuff. Although Elizondo does lean into that stuff a little bit in his public pronouncements, this version of AATIP was apparently not focused on that stuff. So Elizondo had formed a formal working group with other members of the intelligence community. Here it says formal. It wasn't a formal program, but I think this is a quote by him, but again, more of the confusion there about its exact status. So it was set up to discuss and assess UAP activity, whether this working group was itself, properly speaking, part of AATIP-2, or whether it was a network of former AAWSAP insiders and others that was now being utilized by Elizondo to support an individual effort that can be termed AATIP-2. This may be a tedious point of distinction, but it still is another example of ambiguity in the saga. Right, let's go to the next one. Secrecy. So Lakatsky defined this AATIP-2 as a classified endeavor. This loose, unfunded endeavor, variously referred to as a program or activity, was kept from the American public until Elizondo gloomily quit the Pentagon in 2017 and started talking nonstop about it to the present day. And it was located at the Pentagon, at the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. All right. Timing. So it was created years later than AAWSAP, which was again established in 2008. And the AATIP acronym was adopted much later than AAWSAP. AATIP was, of course, already in use as a nickname for AAWSAP. So we really belabor that point, just to draw the distinction between the proper AATIP versus Elizondo's AATIP. All indications are that this informal group, if it was really a group, this informal initiative by Elizondo existed in some form from 2012 to 2017. Part of that portfolio, if we can call it that, but maybe the findings from this unofficial effort were handed off, and then they became the basis for other investigations like the UAP task force, which also had a kind of an unofficial and an official variance, and also the AOIMSG, or AOI, I think AOI or AIOMSG, which is a precursor for ARROW. So there could have been some transfer of data between these different efforts. But we don't know really the deliverables. I think that's in the next slide, actually. Let's go to that. Oh, management. So Elizondo was the head, if you want to call him the head. So we don't really know who was involved. Could have been like an informal network of people that he had formed with during AAWSAP. But again, we don't really fully know what he did at AAWSAP proper. But still, it could have utilized that network of people. And trying to find like different people. Yeah, AAWSAP. Thanks, Steve Long. These people who were kind of experts in different fields and different agencies like Navy, CIA, etc. He could have brought them together. They could have had some discussions about UFOs, trying to figure out what the pilots and others had seen and things like that. There was apparently a share drive known as Y Project on the JWICS. That's the Joint Worldwide Intelligence Communication System, which is the DoD's secure intranet system. So there's apparently some data that was stored there, but that hasn't been released. Let's go to the next one. Funding. So New York Times article in 2017 mistakenly linked a $22 million funding with Elizondo's AATIP, which he claimed that he led. That money was meant for AAWSAP, of course. So nothing went to AATIP, in other words, AATIP-2, despite widespread statements over the last several years. Elizondo himself has said very slim resources. He's given various presentations as well, where he's given some details which have sometimes contradicted each other. But definitely, almost certainly, AATIP-2 was not funded, and it was a very restricted effort compared to AAWSAP. Okay. We go to the next one, please. This is a summary of the US UAP programs from 2008 to the present, and it shows the name, the period, the status, and the organization, so leadership as well. So AAWSAP and AATIP, they occupy two rows there. So September 2008 to December 2010, and then December 2010 to August 2012. So these were official and funded. Lekatsky was the leader, the head, under the auspices of DIA. AATIP-2, what we call Elizondo's unofficial follow-on project. So this was August 2012 to probably August 2017, circa those dates. Unofficial, unfunded, billeted at the Pentagon, or I shouldn't even say billeted. It was just like Elizondo doing his own thing, but he was at the Pentagon at the time. Possibly Stratton, John Stratton was actually the leader of that initiative, but we don't know for sure. There are some rumors here and there, and Stephen Greenstreet has talked about those, but for now, we don't really think there's much to those rumors, but we could be wrong. So maybe, I mean, we should keep tabs on that situation. The UAP portfolio, so September 2017 to December 2017, official funded, and this was under the auspices of Tipton at the Pentagon, and then that evolved into the UAPTF. The first instantiation of that program, that was at the US Navy's Office of Naval Intelligence. John Stratton was the head, and then we have the other version where it was billeted at the ONI and the USD. Again, Stratton was the head. The AOI-MSG, which went on till July 2022, USD Cummings and what was it? Matthew Cummings, and also Sean Kirkpatrick, who would later on become the head of Arrow. And he was just there at the AOI-MSG for a short time, I think the last couple or so months of its existence before it became Arrow. He then went on to become the director of Arrow. So this is still going on to the present day, this organization. It recently put out a very large report, and it's going to do volume 2 very soon as well, about the US government's historical involvement with the UFO subject, and also claims about cover-ups of alien technology or the aliens themselves. Yeah, so Phillips is now the head of that, or the acting director, I should say. Kirkpatrick now works for one of the national laboratories, but he still has some interest in the UAP topic, but he's gone on to other things. All right. Now, we also mentioned here in this kind of more historical section that the UAP phenomenon is just a minor part of the UFO phenomena. So this is a broader term. It's more encompassing, and it includes like all the scare waves in the past, actually stretching back to several centuries. So if you think about, things which are not known about or unexplained in the sky, people have attributed that to various causes through the ages. And of course, more recently, like in the past century, to extraterrestrials, because that's the thing that is on people's minds in the space age. But if you were to go back, you would encounter airship stories, or immediately before the ET hypothesis really took off, it was more to do with like the possibility that the Soviets were flying experimental aircraft over America. But there are certain themes and dynamics that remain consistent throughout all of this history, which is to do with how the media interacts with the topic and spreads these stories. There's a psychosocial aspect as well, where people kind of fit in the motifs that they care about onto those phenomena that they see and can't explain. So you get these waves or these flaps of these sorts of sightings, and they get reported and spread, and then they get interpreted through various socioeconomic lenses. Next one. That's a little table, which is just summarizing some of those scare waves and flaps. So you've got the ghost rockets in Scandinavia in the mid-1940s, so immediately after World War II. Foo Fighters during World War II and similar things. And those were reported in Europe, but also some in other parts of the world. Mystery airplanes, phantom flyers, mystery airships, okay? And as airships were being used more and more, phantom balloon scares, phantom airships, balloon scares, mystery visitors, and balloon fear, and another great fear in France. So if you look at those cases, you'll find a lot of similarities to more recent UFO flaps. We argue that that's the underlying connection is not some mysterious paranormal cause or causes, it's actually human psychology and social dynamics. So in that sense, there is a UFO phenomenon or phenomena, but it's got nothing to do with paranormal or alien visitors. All right, let's go to the next one. So UFO-related legislative provisions for fiscal year 2024. This is a really kind of tedious section. I mean, I still encourage people to read it, but it's probably was the most difficult part to write because there's so much bureaucratic jargon and terminology. You kind of have to sift through it. We got a lot of help with this section from Douglas Johnson, Dean Johnson, sorry. And other people who are kind of experts on the legislative aspects. So the fiscal year 2024 NDAA, which spells out how America is going to spend its money on defense and intelligence programs. And it did allocate some money and interest to the UAP topic. So that's become a very important media item as well. It's being used to sort of inflate the UFO topic to the level of true credibility because now the government is taking it seriously. And yeah, so that's become a huge thing that people have talked about. And there's some legislators who really want to push with this even further, and other ones who want to hold back a little bit because they're concerned that some of the information that gets declassified may be of genuine national security concerns. So you don't want to declassify everything hastily. You want to really be careful about that. Of course, some people take that to mean that the government wants to continue the so-called cover-up of ET existence. Okay, let's go on. So this is a table summarizing some of those provisions. So NDAA for fiscal year 2024, the division within the document. It's just a very small part of the overall document because the rest is about, sensor systems, electronic warfare, missile development, blah, 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 all the stuff that you would expect the US military and IC to request money for. But there's a small part which is dedicated to UAP, and these are the subtitles there for that. Anyway, next one. Now, we do have a word or two to say about the so-called UAP whistleblowers. So David Grush obviously has been the most famous one, but there's been another guy, I forget his name, but there's another person as well now. There's also David Fravor and Ryan Graves, who were Navy pilots, and they had reported their own UAP sightings or encounters, or being at least told by other aviators that they had seen stuff. So they also gave testimony, but then you had David Grush as the sort of icing on the cake, or at least many people thought of him as that, because he was supposedly spilling the beans about all these secret programs which were illegally covering up alien technology from the American public and all that sort of stuff. Now, David Grush has never said that he himself saw any aliens or spacecraft. He was only told by people who had worked in such programs or claimed to him that they had done that. So there's already, many problems with his story and his so-called sources. We've gone into that in other places, or I have in a video of mine, and other people have as well. But there's many problems there. So it's all hearsay and rumor, maybe even manipulation of Grush and others for whatever reason. So there are many reasons that, there could be this sort of mythos which develops within the IC and the military where secrecy and compartmentalization are very common. And on the margins or the periphery of those programs, you may get people who hear certain things about secret projects. Maybe those projects have got kind of cosmic oriented names, and then that adds to the mystery and the intrigue. And then they start to think maybe this is actually alien technology that's being covered up. So that could be happening. There's various programs which have got kind of cosmic connotations or have to do with spacecraft retrievals and things like that. So all of that could be going on. People as well who have had very illustrious careers within the government, they could feel that they didn't get enough from their experience, or they were not at the level that they wanted to be, and so they have a sort of regret about not being able to reach that level. And perhaps to assuage their disappointment, they kind of concoct or they start to believe stories about ET to kind of make their own role or their social status more prominent. All right, let's go to the next one. So the assessment of the book under review, namely Skinwalker at the Pentagon, we do mention that it's got some good things and some not so good things. So it does clear up some confusions. It does add some interesting caveats and details about the program and the people involved, what they did. But the conclusions that they draw from it are completely, in our view, fantastical. So they really credit all this paranormal stuff. They really do see a link between Skinwalker and UFOs, and between UFOs and consciousness in a sort of metaphysical or paranormal sense, whereas we would argue that it's a psychosocial dynamic going on within society and is mediated by the media. Let's see, anything else there? So we also lament that the study of UFOs was not handled scientifically in this program. That was a missed opportunity. And also that their methodology was at times not scientifically sound, because they basically took many UFO encounters and reports as bona fide examples of alien or paranormal visitations or encounters. So when you have those sorts of commitments going in, that can really contaminate the results because you're not being careful about the difference between what's real and what's imagined to be real, okay? So it's sort of like a circular logic or circular argument that they use, which is that they assume what they're trying to prove. They're going into it with a paranormal commitment. Next one, view to the future. So some of the things which could, into the future, what could be done, and some of the possible things which will happen. So we expect that there's going to be some more interest in this topic, but that at some point the bubble's going to burst, and a lot of the people who are pushing the UFO narrative are going to kind of pull back from it to avoid embarrassment. But there will still be a lot of people, including in academia and the scientific community, who will see the government's promotion or acceptance, let's say, of UFOs as a kind of green light to look more into this topic and maybe even to credit some of the more esoteric explanations. So there's, past UFO efforts like NICAP and others, they also had some good and bad points to them. And the current ones are going to have more advanced technology and more resources, but doesn't mean that they're going to be more scientific. All right. We have acknowledgements here. So various people we want to thank for comments and suggestions and corrections. And obviously Stephen Greenstreet, who's done a lot of work on the AAWSAP and AATIP story. And also John Greenwald, who has got this excellent site, The Black Vault, which he's been maintaining for decades. And he's uncovered a lot of very valuable information through FOIA. He does kind of credit the ET hypothesis, but he still is pretty objective, I think, in terms of evaluating the value of certain documents or claims. So he's actually debunked a lot of nonsense and pseudoscience out there, even though we don't fully credit his take. And finally, we end with a cast of characters here. So this table kind of summarizing who is involved in this saga and the various programs that they were involved with. So you can see there on the far left, SRI, Stanford Research Institute, and that was involved with CIA psychic research back in the 70s. So some people who are now involved with the UFO saga were involved back then as well. The ATP, the Advanced Theoretical Physics Project, this was actually run by John B. Alexander. This was an informal effort, and it should not be confused with AATIP, by the way. Completely different, and it ended way before AATIP. But this is like an informal effort by various people within the IC and the military to try to find out whether there was some secret knowledge of the US government of ETs and UFOs. They came to the conclusion that there probably wasn't, even though Alexander himself does have some paranormal beliefs and, credits the Skinwalker stuff as well. Then you've got NIDS, which was set up by Bigelow, so the National Institute for Discovery Science. So they were very interested in consciousness and UFOs. They put out some good stuff and some not so good stuff. And then you had BAS, which was set up to administer or to fulfill the requirements of the solicitation for AAWSAP. Of course, they went on to do their own thing within that, things which veered wildly from what the solicitation said. AAWSAP and AATIP itself, situated within DIA, AATIP-2, which was Elizondo's effort, TTSA, which was a initiative by Tom DeLonge, famous Blink-182 rock band member, who's very interested in UFOs. He cooperated with some people in the UFO scene, including Elizondo. UAP Portfolio, and then the UAPTF. There's two versions within the US Navy, the AOI MSG, and then Arrow, and this other one on the far left there. That's some sort of, with Ryan Graves. So he set that up as a kind of aerial safety and a knowledge database for UAP. Now, one more thing I want to say about the paper. Jack Sarfati, who was a Cornell physicist and very strong believer in the ET hypothesis, he tries to use physics to try to prove that ETs are actually using kind of quantum phenomena to induce like high strangeness effects. That explains kind of time dilation and other things, discrepancies within UFO reports by witnesses. We think that that's like completely off the mark because there's the psychosocial hypothesis, and we think it's just psychology and cognitive science, anthropology, social science are going to explain this, and some anomalous atmospheric phenomena, okay, and sightings which are just misidentified. Whereas he's trying to use physics to try to prove that ETs are actually coming here and linking it to quantum mechanics. So the problem there is that, you know, you're assuming your own conclusions again, just like with AAWSAP. They're committed to the most exotic explanations, and so their databases are going to become very contaminated by that. Anyway, but Sarfati has, you know, issued critiques by email to myself and to Vicente Juan, trying to basically trash the paper because of some things we supposedly get wrong. We did actually get one thing wrong that he corrected, which is that John B. Alexander did not have a PhD in physics. He actually has got a PhD in education. But we think that the reason we initially thought it was physics is just a false memory because Alexander is interested in physics and he's got a PhD. So we probably just conflated those two. We didn't really look too much into that until, you know, Sarfati corrected it. So thanks to him for doing that, but we think that the rest of his critique is not on the mark. Anyway, back to you, Rachel.
All right, guys. How's everyone doing today? Hope everyone's surviving. It's 100 degrees here and quite hot, and my AC is failing me, so it's significantly hotter than I would like it to be. But today we're going to be talking about the Valensole case. This case has been called Europe's #1 close encounter and one of Europe's best UFO cases by some of their top ufologists. It was Jacques Vallée's, I guess, most interesting case, one of his best cases. And Valensole, so I'll just tell you a little bit about Valensole. Valensole is a small town in the French Basis Alps that's kind of particularly well known for its lavender fields, to the point that the Chinese travel there in large numbers when it's during the time of the year that they're growing, in order to take photographs, do things like weddings. And in fact, the scenery is used for a popular Chinese television show. Now, this small commune of Valensole in the Alpes de Haute-Provence is roughly about 3,000 inhabitants that live in it. And it's also known for a much older event, the encounter of a 41-year-old farmer named Maurice Masse. And I also just want to give my usual disclaimer for butchering and mispronouncing various place people names and whatnot. I don't actually speak French, so I apologize in advance for that. And Maurice Masse had this kind of plot of land on this lavender plateau in Valensole, and this is basically where this encounter happened. And this event takes place during, okay, so it starts off, during the last week of June 1965, Maurice Masse and his father had noticed someone that had been picking the shoots from the lavender plants out on their farm, on their little farm or plot of land that's called the Olival. Okay, yeah, sorry, gonna butcher the names. And this plot of land is located roughly 2 kilometers northwest of Valensole. The damage done to their lavender is minor, but he hopes to be able to catch them and kind of put a stop to it. And about a week, it's been going on for about a week. And then on the early morning of July 1st, Masse is with his tractor on a field and he's getting ready to start his day. and he decides to take a smoke break near a tall pile of rubble and debris. It's about 5:45 in the morning, and while he's smoking a cigarette, he's suddenly startled by this loud whistling kind of sound. He decides to step out from behind the pile to get a better look at what is causing the noise. At first, he thinks it's probably a helicopter that has landed in his field, and he would tell people that helicopters have landed in or around his field in the past, and he always makes an effort to go talk to the pilots. He's a hunter, and a lot of these pilots, I guess, like to hunt and fish, and he makes an effort to go talk to them when they land. But instead of a helicopter, he is greeted with an elliptical, or what he refers to as a rugby ball-shaped object that has a semi-transparent cupola on top. The object is resting on 4 to 6 legs. He reports 6 legs in pretty much all the initial reports. But you can only see kind of 4 legs in the drawing there. But 4 to 6 legs, roughly 90 meters away from Massey, in a spot in his lavender field that's just south of a vineyard. And again, like I say, you see 4 legs there. All his initial reports to like the gendarmes and in the media basically say 6 legs. But he would tell ufologist Jacques Vallée that it was only 4 legs. He says this object is roughly the size of a Renault Dauphine automobile, and it has a center pivot, a steel-colored center pivot that is lodged into the ground. And these are these Renault Dauphine automobiles. I guess they're quite popular car in France at the time. And that give you an idea of the kind of size, I guess, or perspective of these things. Now, squatting down on the ground near this device were these 2 figures dressed in these suits that appear to be examining his lavender plants. He would compare the size and shape of these creatures to an 8-year-old child. But as soon as he saw them, he knew this was no ordinary encounter. Massey, aware of the uniqueness of the situation, but a brave and courageous individual. He was a resistance fighter in World War II, and apparently was unafraid, but still cautiously, as to come up upon them with surprise, cuts through this vineyard in order to get a closer look at these creatures. And he would call 6 weeks later in his August 18th testimony or interview to the gendarmerie, quote, "I got within a point 7 meters from the machine by skirting around the vineyard that adjoins my field and then making for the machine, which I could see from an angle. From the moment that I had started out from the heap of stones, I knew that it wasn't with men that I had to deal. And I watched them the whole time I was moving across through the vineyard. Both these beings were down on the ground. They were squatting down. One had his back to me, and the other one was opposite of him. And it seemed to me that they were looking at a lavender plant. When I had got to the distance of 7 meters with them, the one who was facing in my direction then saw me." Now, from his new vantage point of only about 15 to 20 feet away, about 6 or so, 6-7 meters or so, he was able to get a better look at these small men that were standing basically in front of him. And he reports that they're roughly about 1.2 meters in height, and they were covered in these kind of gray-green coveralls. And I will report that in a lot of the initial reports in some of the press reported the coveralls were an orange or like a yellowish color, but most of the reporting refers to them just as like a dark color or a dark suit color. And the color of this craft was supposedly like a little darker than the suit color was. But eventually he would say that they were these gray-green color coverall suits. And he reports that they have these large, smooth, bald, pumpkin-like heads. And their skin is kind of it's a pale skin. I say, quotes, "Their complexion didn't strike me. It was close to that of a white man." Elsewhere, he said it basically looked like a European man. Their hands were bare, but they appeared basically human. They didn't have any facial hair either, in addition to being bald. Where they had these large kind of slanted eyes that I guess sort of wrapped around, towards the side a slight bit. But where the mouth was supposed to be, all there was this kind of like a hole. And these illustrations the problem with illustrations is they don't necessarily represent things exactly accurate. The illustration on the left kind of has a slit for a mouth, but there is basically like a hole. There is no lips. And each of these beings also carried on the one right side a small case, on the left side, supported by a belt, a larger case. And these beings appeared to communicate with each other through this kind of like a grunting, or you could say a gurgling kind of like sound that did not appear to emanate from the mouth, because, as I mentioned, the lips did not move as you would expect when somebody is speaking. And it was more like it was like a guttural kind of like a sound generating from within. Now, one of the and Massey says, quote, "He must have made a sign to the other, I suppose. Both of them stood up, and the one that had turned to face me had made a gesture with his right arm and hand in which I distinguished an object. At that moment, I was immobilized, so I could do no movements. I did not feel anything. I wasn't numb or contracted. I just couldn't make any gestures or move my head, arms, legs, or bodies." So the being that pointed this tube-like immobilizer device at him would place it back in his case on the right side. On the other side was what Massey thought was a larger, what he referred to as a weapon. And he'd say that, he quote, "If they had used the big one, I wonder what would have happened. With that, they can stop an army." Elsewhere, he basically said they could have leveled the whole Valensole plateau with the larger weapon that they had. Instead, they used a smaller weapon on him that is almost kind of like you would imagine the Men in Black neuralizer. It just kind of freezes him in place, but it's not like a muscular contraction, because he still has full control of like his involuntary movements, like his heart's still pumping, he's still breathing, but he's just kind of frozen in place. It's almost like when you go into a sleep state. When you're asleep, you still breathe, your heart still goes, but your body shuts off, your conscious movement and function. So you're not like kicking around and moving around in your sleep. So it was kind of like that. So he was immobilized by this object, and he hints that these beings, may have also had a telepathic communication with him. But he refuses to talk about what happens really after he becomes immobilized. Relentless efforts by investigators over the years to try and discover his secrets would fail. But he would insist that the entities were kind and meant us no harm. And despite their larger skull, which in some places is referred to as 2 to 3 times kind of larger than normal, their faces were typically human, not just humanoid, they were human. Mikhail would suggest that the differences, such as the larger heads and whatnot, were an adaptation for the environment they are from, but it's the typical human form, which would suggest a human genetic code. He even goes on to suggest a potential hybrid breeding program based on selected, utility and function that these alien beings or whatever would need based on the environment and situation. So, and Massey, he would say to Amy McHale, they are good. They have only good intentions toward us. Of that I am sure. And McHale would respond back to him, but how do you know that? And he says, I can tell you, I don't know how I know, but I am sure of it. So he was positive. He couldn't explain why, but he was positive of the good nature of these beings. Now, these 2 small beings, after he becomes immobilized, and there's a little bit of dispute here. One of his reports to the gendarmerie say that it was 4 to 5 minutes after he was immobilized that these beings then took off. And during this time, they were seemingly communicating with each other. But the vast majority of the reports say that immediately after he's immobilized, they quickly enter the craft to kind of take off. And they enter this craft with, what they say is surprising agility. And I was a little bit confused by that, as were others. But what I take it to mean is that the doorway of this craft was not much larger than their frame. It was only slightly taller than they are and only slightly wider than they are. So they kind of had to kind of go into it, not that easily. But they moved through the doorway nimbly, placing the right hand on the door first, and then climbing in and with the left hand. And then this door basically slides up from the bottom to the top. So it's one of these sliding doors again. And with a dull noise, a whistling sound, the pivot that was stuck into the ground retracts back into the hole, disappearing, and the metal legs start to rotate clockwise, almost like a helicopter that was upside down. Those legs apparently start to rotate around. But while it's doing this, there's no dust, or smoke that's raised by the device's movement. And while it's raising up off the ground, Mass observes the two beings are watching him through that transparent cupola that's on the top of the craft. While he's watching these beings, the object begins to move away on an oblique trajectory. So it's moving away in an opposite direction. So if you're imagining the occupants are facing you and looking at you, it starts to move basically like backwards away as they're looking at you in the opposite direction. And it's doing this at immense speed west towards the town of Manosk. And this object remained visible for only about 20 meters in the air before it suddenly just disappeared or vanished in a immense great deal of speed. And Amy McKeel would ask him and try and clarify, like, what he means by vanish, like, does it like disappear, or does it just get so fast that he couldn't follow it anymore? And he had a little difficulty explaining, but he just said it was gone. It disappeared. It was there, and then it wasn't there anymore. And he scanned the sky, and he could not see it. But despite not being able to see it after about 20 meters, they did discover these traces in the ground of going for about 100 meters in the direction that the craft took off from. He's still unable to move for about 15 minutes, and when he's then finally able to slowly recover the use of his limbs. 3 days after the event, he would suffer from bouts of extreme lethargy. He would basically require 12 to 15 hours of sleep a day instead of the usual 4 to 5 hours that he typically required. And this would go on for several weeks before his sleep patterns would return to normal. And after regaining control of his body, he went to investigate the spot this object had rested on. Now, at the landing site, he finds that the ground is soaked, but it will later become extremely hard, like cement, when it dries. And he finds a slight depression that's roughly 1.2 meters in diameter in the shape of a bowl. And within the center, a cylindrical hole about 18 centimeters in diameter and 40 centimeters deep that ends in these 3 small holes that could suggest that some sort of device was opening up from the base of the pivot. And finally, he discovers these 4 furrows forming a cross extending from the center hole. And these cross basically represent where these landing legs were, the 4 points. And he would return later that evening at about 8:30 p.m. with his 18-year-old daughter and discovered that liquid mud that he discovered in the morning had now hardened like cement. And now that center hole had become kind of the shape of a reverse funnel or a sump pump, if you know what that looks like. If you look at that image of the ground traces with those 3 kind of legs, you can kind of imagine it looks like that. And now there's a little bit of uncertainty as to what he does after he regains full mobility beyond checking that landing site. In a later interview with the gendarmeries, he states that, quote, "I remained immobilized for quite a long time after the depression of the machine. I estimate about 15 minutes, obviously daring against my will, and I was afraid of remaining so long without being able to move. Then I was able to move my hands, and almost immediately the whole body and my limbs as before. I then left for my tractor, lit a cigarette, and continued my work until 7:30 or 8 o'clock, mounted on my machine. I hoed my vineyard a little, which is not the one I mentioned above. Then I returned home around 8:30 or 9 a.m. roughly." And he says he has a watch, but he's not in the habit of looking at it, so he's not 100% sure on the time, right? And so in that version of the story, he continues working for at least a few hours or a couple hours before he, I guess, returns home. However, this is not the version that is usually reported. And in most versions of the story, he did not return to work, or he tried to return to work, but his heart was not in it. Instead, he immediately went to town to visit a friend of his, the proprietor of the Café des Sports. And he would report to in one of his first reports with the gendarmes on July 2nd, that it was about 10:30 when he got to his friend's house. So if you recall, this event happened at about 5:45 a.m. If you figure, it was maybe 15 minutes till they took off, maybe 15 minutes after that till he was non-paralyzed, maybe 6:15. Where'd the 4 hours go? So there's almost an element of unexplained or missing time here that hasn't been accounted for, depending on the versions of the stories. But there does, regardless of what version, it seems to be several hours before when this happens to when he actually ends up going to tell his friend the story. And so he gets to this Café des Sports and he tells his buddy this story, who's the proprietor of this cafe. And he tells him, Mass, that he should report it to the police. But Mass doesn't really want any attention, and he doesn't want to be called crazy or to be locked away, or told he's insane, and doesn't want to go out of his way. But his friend of his doesn't really want to leave it there. He ends up going out and checking the landing site and confirming that there are these marks there, and starts to spread the story around the village, and it gets around pretty quickly. And people start to really come to the site and investigate it. And he starts to get large amounts of visitors, and they start to the marks end up getting kind of trampled down a bit. And the story would eventually become to the attention of the local gendarmerie in Valensole commander on the evening of July 2nd. Now, Massey would be interviewed by that local Valensole brigade commander in the evening at about 8 p.m. They would be joined by a company commander and a research brigade commander, I believe from Digny, which is the largest closest town, at about 10 p.m., who conducted a further investigation of the ground and took photos of the site. These photos, they were actually taken on the morning of the 3rd. It was already 11 something at night on the 2nd. And so on the morning of the 3rd, they came back to continue their investigation and take these photos. And on the evening of the 2nd, they they interviewed Mass. And these are some of the photos they took where you can see these these furrows and this landing center impression mark that the thing's up. But that was basically all that was there. They could see that a lot of the other landing marks, I guess, were overrun by the people that kind of visited the site. And the gendarmes themselves noticed the presence of this ground depression, but also, like I said, that the other traces have been erased by visitors. But they're convinced of the kind of good faith and credibility of the witness. He's a respected man around town. Not only does he own this lavender field and farm, he actually owns the local lavender distillery. The lavender is grown and distilled for the perfume industry. And he was a partner with, I believe, two other farmers in the region that owned this distillery that processed the lavender. So he's a respected member of this small town community. And so they took his statement as truthful and in good faith. But for several years, the lavender would have trouble growing at the site. Massey would plow the ground and try to replant the lavender, but the new plants would not take, and they would die and wilt away, shortly after. And the area would become overgrown with like weeds and grass, and you can see that in this picture here. Which I believe this one was taken 2 years later, and you can still see these grass and weeds growing in the area there. And in fact, that imprint would continue to be visible to investigators visiting the site for years. These photos were taken in 1969 by a French physicist who went there to investigate the case, and you could still see the grass and weeds kind of overgrown and running in the field with this craft, kind of allegedly landed. And it would take about 8 to 10 years actually before the lavender would kind of return and start to grow like normal. Now, the press became immediately involved in this story, and a guy, Victor Nathan, who was a journalist with Le Provençal, accompanied the gendarmes on their investigation to the site on the 2nd. He would snag the first interview with Mass and published a story, and this is a translated English title, obviously. Did a flying saucer land in the Low Alps on July 3rd? Now, several other articles would be published over the following days in the regional and French press. The newspaper La Dauphine Libya published an article, A Flying Saucer in the Basis Alps. And these initial 2 articles were what the first article in, I believe, Flying Saucer Review that kind of broke the story to the English. Well, that's not actually true. The first story, I guess, the kind of English UFO literature, the first story in Flying Saucer Review on this was based on these kind of 2 initial newsprint reports. And he would follow it up again with another story the following day on July 4th. The mystery remains, hold on the Valensole flying saucer. Now, not everyone was convinced of the kind of phenomenal nature of this event. And in the Paris paper Le Monde on July 4th, they would publish an article that says the flying saucer was certainly a helicopter. And let's see, it says, yeah. So they were basically convinced that there were several helicopters in the area taking part in this operation, and they certainly would have been flying over on and near Valensole. And we'll get to that kind of operation in a minute, but they start to mention it in the papers almost immediately. But there is a lot of pushback as well. And again, in La Provençale on July 5th, they push back and say saucer, unknown craft, but not a helicopter. And Massey would basically, and a lot of people, understandably would ask, how could he confuse a helicopter at only such a short distance? But the suggestion that it was what was one of these Alouette helicopters, and he couldn't tell it, seemed ridiculous. He would tell people that he counted 6 legs on it, but there was no rotor, no blade. So it wasn't a helicopter. So he's very clear that it could not be a helicopter, despite, the press publishing that was the most rational explanation at the time. And another paper would publish an article, The Saucer of Valensole, Le Meridional, talking about his unusual experience. He was pestered by reporters, many reporters apparently, for several days, quite a few days, that he ended up apparently having a nervous wreck or a nervous kind of breakdown, or at least that's what was reported in a follow-up paper. And he basically got out of town, and went, somewhere else for a while to visit, I guess his daughter. They were on vacation in Guines or something. But he got out of town to get away from the reporters. The reporters still kind of followed him and still, got in touch with him while he was on vacation, to try and get statements from him. But it wasn't, it wasn't only the French press that got involved in this. Pretty much immediately through the various wire services, the U.S. press got involved in the stories. In fact, as soon as July 3rd, the same day the first story published in the French media, it was published in a Lancaster, I believe it's Pennsylvania, newspaper, saying flying saucers, left tracks on a farm, Frenchman says. And it would be published in the Sunday Post. I want to say it's the London Sunday Post on July 4th. And the Washington Post would pick it up for a much larger story on July 5th called Frenchman Sees a Flying Object. And it would be included in many other papers throughout the United States, even just small blips about a Frenchman, encountering small beings on his farm in France. So it got a lot of attention and coverage pretty immediately. You could see how somebody could become overwhelmed and want to get out of town for a while. Now, on August 8th, one of France's leading ufologists would show up on scene to investigate the site. And this is, I've been mentioning him already, Amy McKeel. And he, and the site would also be investigated by a UFO group, GEPA. And they were one of the also first people to publish a report on this story. A local anonymous magistrate for GPA did the investigation, and that was also published in Flying Saucer Review. But on August 8th, Amy McKell shows up to kind of do his own investigation, and he finds that the traces of lavender are visible for a good 100 meters along the direction of the takeoff of the craft. So he found those, those marks that were left after the craft took off. And as far as even, I guess, this little kind of shanty or abandoned house towards Manosque and even beyond. And he says, quote, these traces are degeneration of the young shoots prior to July 1st, which are going dry and falling off, and a singular vitality of the shoots after July 1st. And McHale would return to the site, return to Valensole several more times for a follow-up investigation. In fact, 2 years later, on August 21st of 1967, McHale would come with Flying Saucer Review editor Charles Bowen. They would drive to Valensole to interview Mass and to investigate the site. On this encounter, they would find Mass was calm and serene compared to the visible distress that McHale found him in 2 years earlier. The results of these investigations that both McHale and Bowen and others would be published in Flying Saucer Review over the late 1960s, pretty much starting in fall of 1965. And the last article was published in 1969. Now, one of the things that McHale did in August 1965 when he was there, after he felt that he got all the information out of Maas, because he didn't want to contaminate Maas's story with his own UFO information. So after he felt he got all he could out of him, he decided to show Maas a photo of what was a model of the Socorro, New Mexico craft. And now when Maas saw this photo, which, it wasn't a photo, it was like a model basically. He was shocked. McHale reported that it looked like death kind of washed over him, that this was his craft. He was so surprised, and he would tell McHale, like, where'd you get this? Somebody took a picture of my craft. How'd they get this picture of my craft? And McHale would say, no, this is a model of a craft that a police officer saw in Socorro, New Mexico the year before. And it was so similar to him that he said, you see that I wasn't dreaming and that I'm not mad. And there are plenty of other crafts that kind of match of a similar description. This is a case in Lucca, Italy from July 25th in 1952 of a craft that's also kind of on these legs. It almost looks like there's a different separate kind of platform there, but there's a kind of a ladder going in. It's not exact. But if you look at some of these Socorro, New Mexico kind of illustrations and the artwork, and again, illustrations not exactly like the case in these Socorro illustrations. Apparently, this first illustration is a bit more accurate. It was seen really only on these kind of like two legs like that. These four legs on the ground and on that side is artistic liberty. But if you were to see a Socorro, New Mexico saucer illustration like that and a Valensole one, you could quite easily think that they were of the same siding. In fact, many of the illustrations for Socorro almost look like they were taken, like they're in a lavender field. So he's shown the Socorro, and it was confirmed to him that people are seeing the same thing as him and that it was real. It was not his craft that they took a photo of, but it was identical in his mind anyways. Now, obviously, the most down-to-earth explanation is that Maurice Maas saw a military helicopter that has landed on his field, perhaps one of the Alouette 2 or Alouette 3 type. In fact, Maas did first report that he thought it was a helicopter landing in his field, and that it is, something that they have done in the past, and that he had a habit of talking to the pilots when they had made those stops. And as I briefly mentioned before in that newspaper article, it is in fact known that there was a military operation going on at the time called Provence 65 that had been taking place in the area since June 30th. And this again was published within the papers at the time. And these helicopters were taking off from this base kind of area in the plateau of Albion nearby. And this operation, basically, they were doing maneuvers and practice drills, and I guess one of them perhaps was this drill that of like a potential nuclear attack or disaster. And at this time, or the year before, the Valensole Plateau was actually being considered, along with the Plateau of Albion, as being the location of a nuclear, missile site. They wanted to put a bunch of nukes there. They eventually chose Albion, but Valensole was up for consideration along with Albion in order for that future nuclear project. But we do know at this time that this Province 65 operation was taking place, and it was published in the newspapers. And these are basically the type of helicopters that they suggest, the Alouette 2 and the Alouette 3. And you can see that particularly like this one on the left, while it only impacts the ground in one point, there's two struts. So you could almost mistake that as two legs, but only getting one ground imprint from that. You don't get the same kind of ground imprint you would with the ones that kind of have these track kind of legs. But if you also look at the kind of pilot uniforms, you can see the descriptions are kind of fairly similar. You've got a covered, they're wearing these coveralls. The helmets they're wearing makes their heads look bigger, and like they have got large wraparound eyes. And the size of a normal soldier kind of squatting down might be about 1.2 millimeters. And this paper shows basically flashlights that these kind of guys might be carrying that do look like these tube-like devices that you might see. Now this is from a paper by an Eric Malot, where he discusses the psycho kind of traumatic effects of kind of a psychotrauma theory for this case, where he did have this experience, but the details perhaps kind of got distorted. And he describes, I just kind of want to read here, a psychotraumatic event is a phenomenon of an invasion of the psyche and an overflowing of its defenses by violent excitations associated with the occurrence of an event that is aggressive or threatening to the life or integrity, either physical or just psychically, of an individual who is exposed to it as a victim or as a witness or as an actor. And he says it's usually things like disasters, accidents, assaults, attacks, and events are likely to generate these psychotraumatic disorders. And when you're suffering from one of these kind of episodes of depersonalization or derealization, you suffer from effects that match quite well with producing experiences like this. It says derealization may be associated with this experience as the feeling that the external world is strange or unreal. The subject may perceive disturbing changes in the size or the shapes of objects, known as macropesia or micropesia. People may seem strange, sometimes even robotic appearing. Other frequently associated features include anxiety symptoms, depressive symptoms, obsessive rumination, somatic preoccupations, and altered perceptions of time. These associated disorders are characterized by a partial or complete loss of the normal functions of integration of memories, consciousness, identity, or immediate sensations, loss of control of bodily movement. Dissociative stupor characteristics characterizes victims in a dazed and stupefied state. So his theory is essentially, this guy could have had an encounter with these helicopters, perhaps due to kind of a post-traumatic stress event, perhaps from his experience as a resistance fighter during the war, and this encounter with these military helicopters, or and these men in military garb, basically was a traumatic incident to him. And those effects do, you can see they match in a way. You do get kind of like a body paralysis. You kind of get frozen, and you've seen that, in people that just get terrified for something. It's like they're not physically paralyzed. It's just they can't move. They're kind of just like stuck there. And he suggests that that's kind of what happened in this case here. I want to see if I can bring up a video here so you can see one of these things. And I want you to pay attention at the end of the kind of the sound these things make. So when these helicopters both shut down and take off, you get a loud, high-pitched kind of whine or whistling kind of sound that is basically what was reported by Mass when he was startled by that sound and wanted to see what was going on. And that sound, you know, he did believe it was a helicopter at first, possibly partially because of that sound he heard. And so that's one thing to take into consideration. But you also have to, again, ask how he would be confused by seeing a helicopter. And he was quite certain that it did not contain a rotor or any of these other aspects that a helicopter typically had. And how was he paralyzed? You know, if these beings pointed something at him, how was he paralyzed? Again, we have an answer, a psychological answer. Let's see, let's remove that from stage. And Amy McHale would comment as well that, quote, the police who made the first investigation state categorically that the shape of the marks on the ground show that they were made by no known type of machine, which is contrary to the explanations of the military authorities who have not even examined the marks. So, helicopter, not a helicopter. That's the rational explanation that was given at the time. So the rational explanation that is still given. Now, but later, Jacques Vallée, a French-American ufologist, would meet with Mass in May 1979. And he met with Vallée. He confirmed that this object actually only rested on 4 legs, not 6, which again contradicts all the kind of earlier reports in which it was reported as 6 legs. In fact, reports in the media, and he would tell people it looked like a monstrous spider. Although spiders do have have 8 legs, not 6 legs. So Vallée met with him, and he would also go on to tell him that he had witnessed these craft on other occasions as well. And this is something that he would share with Amy McHale when they were there in 1967, that he would have these other sightings or encounters in the area. He shared one of these stories in which he was kind of laying in bed, sleeping one night, and he was woken up as if kind of almost told by a voice, you know, he got this feeling that they were back and that he should go look at the sky and, you know, see if he could see this object again. And when he gets there, he sees a light traveling past. Now, this event took place the exact time and location of a Russian of a Cosmos rocket reentry event that was seen by many people in the area, and that unfortunately was likely what he saw. But there's, you know, reason to believe that he had several more, at least sightings, and was told of other sightings by people in the area over the years. And he would deny to Vallée that this kind of experience had any sort of religious implications for him, but it clearly did affect him on a deep level. Vallée, like many of the investigators before him, would try and get his secrets out of him, you know, try and figure out more what happened after he became immobilized before the beams took off, see if there was this message that was kind of given to him. But like the investigators before him, Vallée would leave with the feeling that it was, quote, clear Mass had never told the entire truth about his experience. And I just want to show you guys a clip real quick here of Vallée briefly talking about this on a talk show.
Because this goes on all over the world, right? All different governments have
absolutely
the same stuff going on, right?
I've had a chance to study cases, of course, in France, all over Europe, and in South America, and of course in the U.S.
What's the weirdest case you've ever studied?
I'm not sure weird is the right term for it. The most stimulating from a scientific point of view is a case in France in which a farmer was starting his tractor at 6 o'clock in the morning, and he saw something in his field some distance away, and he thought it was a helicopter or maybe a strange car that shouldn't have been there in his field. Mm-hmm. So he walked over, and all of a sudden he was paralyzed. He saw 2 small creatures. They were not quite the ones that you have here. They were very small, but they had normal heads, and they had normal human features, but he was paralyzed. And they started speaking to each other in some strange language, went back into the object took off. The interesting thing is that there were traces left. Those traces were studied by various agencies of the French government. There was no question he was not lying. The traces could not be duplicated. And he was paralyzed for 20 minutes after the object left, which is very interesting from the point of view of the effect of the kind of radiation that object may have been creating. And this is a very common report on the part of witnesses, this feeling of paralysis.
So this case obviously had a great impact on Vallée, and he considers it, one of the most stimulating cases he has ever worked on. He would publish it, talk about it first briefly in his book Dimensions, and he would discuss it more deeply in his chapter on botanical data in his book Confrontations: A Search for Alien Contact. Now, however, he would do a candid interview with that French physicist that I mentioned, visited him, he would do a candid interview. When that French physicist visited, he tried to talk to Maass, but in fact, he met Maass. Maass basically lied and said he wasn't Maass, that, oh yeah, I look like him, but I'm not him. And basically wasn't able to get an interview with Maass. But he was able to get an interview when he tried to show up again that next day to try and again catch an interview with Maass. Unsuccessful. Met Maass's wife and talked to her. And she would relate to him that it was actually a very spiritual experience for Maass. He was permanently changed by the experience, and it would kind of end up following him for the rest of his life. She said, quote, Maass had a feeling of religious respect for the beings from space. He regarded the landing site as having now become their property, as a sacred place where he, Maass, was merely the manager. In fact, she says that he stopped watering the ground, which may have something to do with the plants not growing. But so he stopped watering the ground because he felt that it wasn't his place to mess with the ground, that this land was the property of these beings that landed there. But there's a little bit of a problem with this, though, because if it was such a sacred place that he ordered people not to touch or mess around with, and he supposedly told his family not to sell the land and to never mess with the land, even after he died, then why did he talk about, one, wanting to dig it all up, right after it happened? And in fact, his wife did say he buried the hole back in. And he did replow and reglow the area several times. So that kind of contradicts this story that he considered it kind of like sacred holy land that he wouldn't touch anymore, and he didn't want anyone else to touch. But that is what his wife reported. But he reported to Vallée directly that it was not a spiritual case for him. But whatever happened, it had a deep impact on him for the rest of his life anyway. Now, this case was also later investigated. The French UFO group Japan wasn't around at the time. They didn't establish themselves until May 1977, and Japan basically says the group on unidentified aerospace phenomenon. And they looked at this case and ended up classifying it as what's called a D-type phenomenon, which means it was not identifiable by experts who had basically comprehensive, accurate reports and were still unable to come to a final conclusion. I imagine it's somewhat similar to kind of like how Hynek would describe a UFO. And so they leave this case as a class D or D-type phenomenon case. But 20 later, a group of former HEDN members, and HEDN was the Institute for Higher Studies of National Defense, would produce a famous French report called the Cometa Report, which Leslie Kean is actually kind of famous for publishing in English and writing stories about, and it kind of what brought her into the UFO phenomenon, supposedly. And the Cometa Report included the Valensole case in its featured prominently in its report that it put out in 1999. And it basically even went so far as to saying that the witness who was shot with this tube or paralyzing device explained it away as a pulsed microwave effect. similar to being used today by other anti-personnel microwave weapons. And so they kind of reach, I think, a little bit with that. They concluded that the witness, kind of like the gendarmerie did, that he didn't exhibit any of these kind of behaviors that would suspect mythomania, or that he was kind of hoaxing this situation. And it's one of the very few cases that they consider unexplained, despite what they consider the richness of the data available. And this story would continue to be published kind of in popular media and culture. Throughout this presentation, I have used slides from a French comic by Guigui and Loeb that I had translated the text into English. But it was also featured in an American comic series called UFOs and Flying Saucers that was published by Gold Key Western in the late 70s. And they take a bit more liberty with the way they illustrate and visualize this case than the French comics that I used earlier did. But it's still cool to look at all these different places illustrate this. And I actually own this comic right there in excellent shape. And this story would kind of be taken up by this guy, would kind of become its advocate, Maurice Chespeau. And he was Mass's neighbor. And Mass was, again, he didn't like to talk to people about this story. He really wasn't interested in sharing it and telling it to people. And so when press and reporters would come around, this other Maurice, would basically do the interviews. And in a lot of the coverage you can find in documentaries and various news coverage going back some years, this guy is kind of like the main advocate keeping the story alive. And it's important to note that Maurice Mass died 20 years ago, so he's no longer with us. His grandchildren still are, however. And this guy also runs this kind of local heritage association, where he's got this mural that's painted of the incident and newspaper articles from the time. And he's put on various kind of festivals and events. In 2015, he put on a major kind of a UFO conference in Valensole to celebrate the case. And they hold these expositions in town. There's one right now. So if you happen to live in Valensole or visiting Sullivan, France, through the entire month of July, you can go and visit this Valensole case exposition that they've got going on there. I don't know if they do it every year. I don't know about last year. I know they did it in 2022. But they do these events to kind of keep the story alive and going. And in fact, they kind of erected a historical landmark kind of out at or near the site. I don't actually believe it's located on the exact coordinates. I think it's kind of like across like the road. And this appears to be a temporary marker that they initially built perhaps at one of the earlier expositions because it looks a bit cheaper and a bit less structurally sound than what is there now if you use Google satellite and kind of like shared Google photos to look at it now. The craft looks to be a bit more structurally sound and permanent. And instead of these little green guys, they've got an actual kind of like a farmer moss figure, and they've got like a little guy kind of like next to the craft. But this is a temporary marker, and people still come out to visit it. You know, like I say, this is like Europe's supposedly best close encounter case. And so people that are out there in France like to visit this location, and they can visit this landmark that you can find on Google Maps. It's called under a waymark called Valensole's ET. And in fact, a year or two ago, this guy, Dominique Fidhol, again, sorry about the name, would produce this documentary or drama. I believe it's a split. I have not seen it. I would love to see it one day with subtitles. But there's obviously at least a bit of an element of dramatization. I think it's kind of like a docudrama where they had actors kind of recreate the scenes. That's kind of interesting. And they talked to his grandson and whatnot. Now, there's a lot of one of the things that kind of stands out to me about this case is that I'm almost a little surprised that it's considered kind of the top close encounter, because it's really not unique, like not even remotely. Like, in fact, there does not really seem to be anything really impressive or unique about this case at all. If people are aware, France and Italy had a big wave of sightings in October 1954. Some of the more famous one was the Marius de Wald sighting in Quadruple, France. But there was many sightings, and all you have to do is look at Jacques Vallée's book, Passport to Magonia, turn to the middle of October 1954, and you can read dozens of cases almost identical to Maurice Masse's sighting, involving these small 4 feet or so tall dwarf creatures, involving paralyzation rays or beams or devices that paralyze either the person or a dog or something. And then these crafts tend to take off or hover, be briefly visible above the ground for a while before disappearing in advanced speed. And so there's kind of this long history of these short dwarf-like entity encounter cases with paralyzing rays in the French countryside. In fact, in many locations where Masse lived, and were reported in the same newspapers, regional and local newspapers that published his story. So it stretches the imagination to believe that he was not fully aware of many of these other stories that were going around in the town that he lived in. But it's up to you, I guess, to decide whether you thought he got some of the elements from his story. I think it's possible there's definitely some cultural contamination or contamination from other events that kind of potentially seeped in to the story. And kind of one other thing I just noted that stuck out to me when I stumbled across these illustrations. This is from the first French edition of translation of H.G. Wells' book, The War of the Worlds, illustrated by Henrique Avim Correa. And in one of these illustrations here, you can almost see it where it kind of almost looks like it's rugby ball shaped, and it's got this center kind of like drill pivot behind it, and it's on legs. On the photo on the other side, it doesn't really so much look like an elliptical object or rugby shaped ball, but again, you see these kind of central pivots, and they're standing on, four legs, and the one's shooting a ray gun. So there's clearly a lot of potential, both contamination from science fiction and just a long history of UFO cases of this type in the very region and areas of France, that Masse would be familiar with. So with that, I will leave you basically with something that Masse relayed to Vallée when he was there in May 1979 in regards to his sighting and what he thought about it. And again, McHale would also, Amy McHale would earlier in August 1967 say that Mr. Masse is a man that there dwells a certainty, a man who no longer displays any curiosity as to what the folk who have studied the question at great length, like Charles Bowen and myself, might say to him. So he says, Masse basically knows what he saw. He doesn't need convincing, and he doesn't need to convince anyone else. And unlike us ufologists who have not experienced it and have been looking for answers, he's already got the answers. And he says this to Jacques Vallée. To observe something like this was, quote, the very best thing I could wish on anyone, but added that a witness should not say anything, not even to his wife and children. One always says too much. So he leaves us in this case with this, a bit of mystification where, we don't know all the details. It's potentially likely we'll never know all the details. Supposedly he may have shared some of these secrets of his with some researchers. There's a lady investigator who says she plans to publish further information in a book, but it's only coming out after she is dead. So it's going to be a posthumously published book of hers. So not only is Masse dead for 20 years now, we have to wait for this lady to die before we get to hear what he supposedly may have said at some point way back when. Honestly, I don't see all the point for that mystification and keeping these secrets, but Masse felt that you shouldn't tell these encounters to anyone, apparently. And so we are, again, like many of the cases I've covered, a fascinating and highly strange case, but again, with only one witness. We are left thinking perhaps it was a helicopter, perhaps it was a traumatic incident. Maybe it was another explanation was the waking dream that we've seen given for many of the cases that I've covered, the Emilson case, the Joe Symington pancake case. And to me, that does seem actually quite plausible. We have all this missing time between when he showed up to tell his story and when this incident took place. And perhaps that's because when he was out there smoking a cigarette, he actually just fell asleep. And in a state of kind of a lucid dream, one of these helicopters landed in his field and he distorted the facts, and it became, this crazy story that when he woke up that he went and told people. Who knows? That's, I guess, will be up to you to decide. Or maybe he was visited by these creatures from elsewhere. I guess we'll never know. Again, like all these stories, the main witnesses are dead. There's nowhere we can really else go with the evidence, I think, at this point. And it'll be up to other people to decide what they want to deal with this case. But honestly, while it's a fun and very interesting case, and there's a lot of material on it, I don't see why it's been put up as like the best case, because it's not even particularly unique. I think there's probably far better cases in Europe to be addressed. Oh, thank you guys very much.
So I just realized at some point during the show that my mic was not plugged into my computer. So sorry if my computer was making weird sounds at the beginning.
I didn't notice it. Yeah, it's yeah.
Hey, Jeff. One thing that immediately occurred to me is the shape of that UFO in that French case. It sort of looked kind of like an egg, right?
Yep.
So would you say that, is there any evidence that there's a preponderance of like egg shapes in like rural or farm-based UFO sightings, which could kind of speak to obviously the motif of an egg, because that's what people kind of used to there. But also like Brian Santes and others have spoken of the egg as a kind of alchemical symbol of creation. So do you think those things could be incorporated into that sighting?
Yeah, maybe it's possible. I do know that there are sightings that go back that are described in the same way. I found a sighting from, I think, Nice, but it was a sighting in 1954, again described as a rugby ball shaped object, with things coming off of it. And so, and many of these sightings in France in these rural areas and even Italy were described as kind of like these elliptical or kind of rugby ball or ovoid shaped kind of like objects. And of course, we got them in Socorro and other places in the U.S. But as far as why they actually see them as that kind of shape, I mean, who knows? Like I said, I can see a comparison with the helicopters personally, particularly if you were kind of suffering from either a traumatic incident or like a waking dream. I know that I've been kind of half awake where things have been going on around me, and I kind of wake up with like this like distorted memory of like what happened, that it does seem quite real, to you. Many times seems more real than real life seems to you, and I can see how you can get confused. But again, with this guy, there's a lot of these guys, there's these contradictions, right? Like a lot of people say that this guy's trustworthy, like he'd never tell these crazy stories. We believe him; he's a good member of the society. But then you actually will read with Mass at least one newspaper where they said they talked to townspeople and said Mass is known for telling literal fish tales. Like he loved to brag about trout he caught as long as his arm, and he was known for telling crazy, dramatic, fantastical stories around town that people found fascinating and interesting, which contradicts literally everything else in the literature. Like that's only mentioned in like one of the news articles. So it's like you always got, some people in the town that will back up the guy, say this guy's like top level. He'd never, make up something, and he'd never have a crazy experience. And But one thing I forgot to mention that I think is important to note when talking about these potential psychological explanations is that a lot of people are like, but he's not crazy. Like he's a sane, reasonable, level-headed guy. And the problem is like people thinking of it as crazy. These events happen to literally everyone, all humans. It's not like a special, unique kind of person that suffers from these various psychotraumatic episodes or waking dreams, or we are all susceptible and become victim to them. And they're typically like many times transient one-off events, and they're not indicative of like larger pathological issues with the people involved. And so rarely despite this kind of straw man that's rarely put up that you're calling people crazy, rarely are you saying they're actually crazy and they're hallucinating. It's more often you're saying that perhaps they're misperceiving things or that they're suffering from memory issues from other incidents. That doesn't make them crazy. They're still perfectly normal functioning members of society. They just had a one-off incident. And I think that's important to note that even if what he saw wasn't the experience as it really happened, does not make him a crazy individual that just hallucinated it all. That's another word I kind of hate that's used in ufology because, again, rarely things are outright hallucinated. Like you're not just seeing things that are not there. You're seeing something. You're just misperceiving, misinterpreting what it actually is. And I think it's important that we distinguish that and kind of get rid of a lot of these straw men that, you're calling people crazy and unwell when that's not what you're saying at all. Like, you or me could just as easily be susceptible to having one of these incidences where we, drastically reinterpret, our experiences in a fantastical way. So,
yeah, I agree.
I also found that a lot of people get into the various nuclear aspects and that nuclear project that they put some like 18 nuclear missiles. France wanted to show the world that, they're at power and they're ready to fight back. And so there's that competition at the time that I guess also potentially would have had drastic effects on like the local economy and like lavender fields and plowing and stuff if you're kind of going to go replace that with a nuclear facility. And so, there could have been some underlying stress, going on over that situation. And ultimately, like I said, they chose the Albion Plateau a little bit, nearby instead of the Valensole Plateau. But they were doing those military operations, which from what I read may have included simulated like nuclear attacks. And maybe he encountered one of these kind of very secretive like nuclear attack simulations and they put the fear of death in him. And, that kind of created a traumatic experience to him. Maybe these guys even went a little overboard with like the threats and that triggered, a post-traumatic stress incident from his time serving in the resistance during World War II. Who knows? Again, we can't talk to him. We could talk to some of the people that are still around that knew him and try and kind of gather more information about how he was affected by it. But again, with this case, so many people seem insistent on continuing the mystification factor and keeping it, a mystery. So I'm not sure we'll ever get anywhere else with it, unfortunately.
Well, a couple of notes on the show tonight. It's really hot here on the West Coast for all of us, and we're just sitting here sweating bullets. Also, apparently, Jeff's dog, Dorothy, is feeling ill, so please, everyone, send your wishes for Dorothy.
Yes, have her in your thoughts. She's not even... I don't know where she is now. She's been laying on the ground and she hasn't eaten anything in a couple of days and she threw up in 4 separate places right before the show that I had to clean up before the show. And she's drinking water, but I hope it's just a temporary bug. So yes, send her your good wishes and thoughts.
Some of the things that Jeff goes through preparing for this show, he's such a trooper, and I'm so grateful for him.
Maybe my presentation, my trial run I gave her beforehand was just so nauseating that it made her spew all over the ground. Who knows? Dorothy, are you making fun of my presentation? No, but yeah, thank you.
Oh yeah, it could be the heat. That's a good point, Rich. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Also, another thing, this segment that we're doing right here is what we like to call, or what I like to call, the banter segment. So it's basically like, we get to talk on the show, but we don't really get to the meat of, a sort of discursive and potentially critical response until the Ufos Chat next week. But in the future, what we're planning to do during this segment, instead of doing banter, is we're going to actually cover the book UFO eyewitness, or what is it called? The Reliability of UFO Witness Testimony. So that's what you can expect during this part of the show. In our next episode, we'll just be going through the book chapter by chapter, I think, is probably what we're going to do. And talk about...
If you guys recall, I talked about 3 of the chapters in one of my previous things.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Well, we're going to start from the beginning of the book and run through it. And then when we get around to those chapters, we'll just talk about them again.
Sounds good. Because there's a lot to learn from that. Like I said, when that book came out, I've shared it a lot, and I continue to share it because the chapters are so great. And there's so many people in this topic that won't even look at that book. They see a book that's about the reliability of witness testimony, and they're like, it's just debunker garbage. We're not going to read this debunker nonsense. And that's not a good approach to take, because if you are serious about finding true mysteries, you need to be able to understand, the frailty of human memory, of witness testimony, and these other factors if you're interested in actually getting to the truth. And a lot of these chapters are written, they're not actually mainstream. They're not skeptics or debunkers. A lot of them are actual mainstream ufologists that have written these chapters, like Eddie Ballard, Ballestromos, a lot of these guys. So it's important to read this stuff, and I wish more people would look at stuff like that instead of just having a knee-jerk reaction to dismiss it. That all it is going to be debunking people's experiences. And it's not about debunking people's experiences. It's about understanding them better.
Yeah.
And yeah. So
I agree. Yeah. And if we want to find the really weird, highly strange experiences, that people have actually had, then we have to be able to identify those amidst all of the other reports. That's another type of signal to look for. If you're looking for ball lightning in UFO reports, then you're going to look for a particular type of reporting data. And if you're looking for high strangeness, uncanny, or visionary, experiences that involve entities and the Oz factor and stuff like that, how do we parse those experiences out from the reporting data?
Yeah.
Was there any... Go ahead, Luis.
I was going to say, to add to Jeff's comment about the book, that you can't have science without a baseline. And so if you ignore the question of the reliability of testimony, you're just ignoring that, and you're automatically contaminating your own, supposed scientific endeavor.
Yeah. Yeah. There's this line between people that actually want to investigate, cases and, to come to answers, and the group of people that really don't even think they should be investigated, that the experiencer is always right, should never be questioned, and you should take everything they say as absolute literal fact. And how dare you even try and analyze or question the experience these people had. And that's, that's one way to go. That's but it's not a scientific way to go. If you're trying to scientifically study this, if you're trying to find answers, you have to be able to look and analyze people's experiences and situations.
Yeah, and ultimately, if you want to find some sort of weird new thing in nature, then the best way to rationally go about it is to use a null hypothesis and try to disprove whatever fantastic hypothesis that you're really interested in, rather than trying to prove it.
Mm-hmm.
And it also helps to know the weird and unusual things that happen in nature that aren't unknown, but are just rare and could be potential explanations. Because if you don't know, then that's again why, and I mentioned in a previous episode why it's so important to study IFO cases, identified flying saucers. And I got a bit of kickback earlier this last week on one of the cases I posted, which was another road sign that basically they'd taken a photo of it as you drive by a road sign, and it looks like a spinning, almost kind of like a saucer. And that recalls the famous sighting here in Oregon, the Willamette Pass photo. And I got a lot of grief from some people for posting that. Like, what are you trying to do? Bring stigma and ridicule to the topic? Posting identified cases like this? Like, why are you posting this garbage? Why don't you just post it? It's like, well, first of all, I post historical information. Not every case is going to turn out to be fantastical or phenomenal. But it still happened. It's still part of the historical record, and it still, deserves to be recorded, preserved, and shared. But also being said, like, we tend to learn more from IFO cases than we do from unidentified cases, because really we can't learn a whole lot from an unidentified case because it's unidentified. We haven't, figured it out or learned anything from it. It's from those IFO cases that we do identify that we can kind of, figure out baselines and kind of create a library in our mind of potential explanations that when a sighting happens, and we can say, hey, that shares a lot of similarities with the sighting that turned out to be a rocket reentry case, or that shared a lot of similarities with a sighting that turned out to be a barium cloud, and we can kind of go mine our brains for potential rational explanations that we can then go test for and see if they are, a legit explanation. But we learn from them, and so we need to study them.
Okay, well, on that note, for our final story tonight, there is no final story. This author failed to write a final story tonight simply because she forgot to, and then she paradoxically wrote a story about it 10 minutes before the show. It was a very brief story, as it ended with these words. Before we go, if you enjoy this show, we would like you to please consider subscribing to our channel, Ufo Sunset. Please also hit the like button and hit the notification bell icon if you'd like to get notified about upcoming videos. And come and join our cozy and intimate live chat. A great plus for joining the live chat is that you can give us constructive feedback live on the air, especially if we make any factual errors. You can also join our Discord, a temporary link to which will be found in the episode description as soon as I add it there after the show. Here at Ufos, our political and personal views are not the same, and the work of each of us is independent work. Personal views or positions expressed in individual pieces are not necessarily those of Ufos, who is not a person and has no views, or myself. Please be sure to check out our respective content. I can be found at the Earth YouTube channel. Visit Luis Cayetano's website, ufologyiscorrupt.com, and he'll give you $5. Not really. And you can find Jeff Knox's daily posts on history and the science of UFOs on Twitter or Facebook. Jeff Knox spends all of his time studying UFOs, and he makes almost no money off of it. Please consider visiting his Patreon page and becoming his patron. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Luis. Thank you, XRichX. Thank you, Drew Williamson. Thank you, Steve Long. Thank you, Timothy Brigham. Thank you to all of our lovely viewers. And in the words of the disc, the truth is out there, but so are lies. swear, I don't know why this is happening.
The words of the disc said, "That's spaceman's business, not man business. Spaceman business."
I'm sorry. I don't know why this is happening. All right. Good night, everybody.
Whatever.